Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello and a very good afternoon, distinguished guests, esteemed speakers, and members of the academic and policy communities. Welcome and thank you for joining us today at today's special occasion, the public lecture titled Navigating the New World Disorder, A View from the Dismal Science by Professor Joseph E. Stiglitz. My name is Zahra, and I'm honored to be your MC for this event right here at the Asia School of Business. I would now like to call upon INCEIF Khairul Falah Shamsul Bahrain from INCEIF University to recite the Dua for today.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا ولوالدينا وارحمهم كما ربونا صغارا ولجميع المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Oh Allah, on this blessed afternoon, we beseech Thee your guidance and mercy. Make this event, public lecture Navigating the New World Disorder, a blessed one. Grant us space for thought, elevation in understanding, and renewal in the means of spreading knowledge. O Allah, open for us the gates of wisdom, bless our minds and ideas, and make the insights and innovations we share beneficial to others and sincerely for your noble sake. O Allah, make our gathering a gathering blessed with your mercy, and our parting a parting protected from sin. And do not let there be among us, with us, or following us, anyone who is wretched, rejected, or deprived of your mercy. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما ولا تجعل اللهم فينا ولا معنا ولا من يتبعنا شقيا ولا مترودا ولا محروما. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
To begin this momentous occasion, it is now my great honor to invite Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar, Chairman of the Board of Directors of INCEIF University, to deliver his welcome remarks. Please welcome Tan Sri Azman.
Yeah, thank you very much, pengacara majlis. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you. It gives me a great honor and pleasure to give the short opening remarks at this beautiful auditorium when Tan Sri Zeti, who can be very persuasive as we know, persuaded me when I was at Khazanah, Dr. Faisal, to sponsor a piece of this beautiful institution. I said auditorium because I thought I dreamed, Joe, for afternoons like this, that we are graced by an old friend of Malaysia, Professor Joe Stiglitz. A round of applause, guys, please. So when we heard Joe and indeed Anya was coming to town, it started, it triggered this competition between all this. Everybody wanted to host you, Joe. So I think you would approve that we came to a nice equilibrium. The three of us came together and said, okay, let's do this together. Three institutions, all close to Tan Sri Zeti and perhaps to myself as well, because first of all, ASB was set up 10 years, Tan Sri, roughly. And you'll be pleased to know it's also a collaboration with one of your alma maters, the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Sloan School, and our central bank. And I found out today, Deputy Governor Hisham, Dr. Hisham was instrumental in that process. Thank you. Secondly, Khazanah Research Institute itself was also about 10 years ago, Dr. Nong. because at that time, Dr. Faisal, we were doing a lot of stuff that we thought we better separate between the macro stuff and the buy-side stuff, which is today thriving, of course, under your leadership. But if I recall, Nong, we did say, Dr. Soraya's here, Dr. Sharon's here, the founding CEO, let us focus, there's so many stuff to cover, this is the field of economics, but let's focus on one thing, which has many roads and many paths, which is inequality, a topic very close to Joe. In fact, it's so close, I picked up the FT this morning. Some of you may not have had a chance to read yet. The op-ed on page 17 has two, well, the president of Brazil, the president of South Africa, and the Prime Minister of Spain. They also came together and a tripartite op-ed. We face an inequality emergency. And I quote in one of the early paragraphs, Nobel Laureate Joseph Stiglitz and a team of experts recently delivered the G20's first ever report on global inequality based on extensive global evidence and inputs and the experience of countries from every corner of our planet. It concluded that we face an inequality emergency just as we face a climate one. So this is the twin, big crisis that we as a species is facing. And Joe spent, a whole lifetime in a distinguished career fighting that, both in the realm of ideas, as a public intellectual, as an activist, as a policy advisor. So perhaps I just wanted to say three, very brief. I recall as I was preparing for this short speech that 3 close encounters with Joe of the pleasant and inspiring kind, if I may add. The first, not far from here, the scene was 1998 or thereabouts. This was the Asian financial crisis. I see some old hands here. Coughlin, I'm looking at you. We were analysts and looking at the crazy market at that time. In fact, some of us wrote about what we call the convergence theory. When the stock market index converges with the air pollution index, it's okay, we're going to mati anyway, everybody's going to die. So you need a bit of gallows humor to get through that, which we did. But here it was, the chief economist of the World Bank, coming off the magisterial piece called the East Asian Miracle, Joe. As students, we read that in great detail. The World Bank did a famous report, around about 93, if I recall. But anyway, the scene was University Malaya. The sky was not very clear, the index was falling, things were falling apart. But here was Joe giving a lecture which I sneaked in. Actually, you don't need to sneak in, it was a public lecture at University Malaya, essentially criticizing his employers, the bank, and the fund, which kind of portended what was going to happen next, which Malaysia, of course, with Tan Sri Zeti and others, took a rather bold decision to do the so-called heterodox selective capital controls. The rest is history. The second close encounter, Joe, that I picked from, several close encounters, I was lucky enough. The year was 2018. I think it was Davos. Dr. Nong was probably there. And this was just after Mr. Trump's kind of, speech in the Congress Center, the big hall. So as I was coming out, so everybody was there, and, again, this was like a premonition of things to come. That all these corporate titans were there, all going over each other. The first persons I saw there was Joe with Anya, and Anya had this T-shirt with a white T-shirt with very clear letters that says "Not my president." So very memorable, and she was grinning away, and I just took the opportunity. Joe will remember that, right? This is just after Mr. Trump's talk. But the final one I wanted to end with was, to those of us at Khazanah, we were very privileged in 2007 when our country turned 50. Dr. Nong led that project as the head of research. We said, how do we kind of, give our contribution? So we decided, let's start all this knowledge series, because knowledge is always good, Tan Sri. Jadi we were honored to have not one, but 3 Nobel Laureates out of 5 speakers that year. Mr. Kofi Annan, late head of the UN. Second, Muhammad Yunus, our the Nobel, who's now the president, interim or otherwise. And of course, Joe. But Joe stayed the longest throughout the National Day celebration as a guest of then Prime Minister Pak Lah, Tun Abdullah. Fatiha for him. But the speech, which we kind of documented inside a book to memorialize, I went through a couple of days ago, and I mentioned to Joe, I counted in your speech 65, at that time we were 50 years old, now we're 68, 65 references to Malaysia or Malaysians. So in other words, this was not some, off-the-shelf speech. Joe took the time and the bandwidth to really research and do something really bespoke for us. That's our friend. So ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of things that worry us these days, but we always have a chance when we have people like Joe around. In fact, Joe, this to me, the planets, if I may say, are aligned somewhat. Beautiful mind, a big heart, and as one of your secretaries of state said, lots of cojones, which is very important. So I think the planets must always align. And on that note, we welcome and we look forward to listening to Joe, moderated by Dr. Nong, representing KRI, and later for Tan Sri Zeti, who of course was a member of the Stiglitz Commission of the UN about in the wake of the Lehman crisis, right? Shortly after, to look at the financial system. So many things, and Tan Sri will close the proceedings later today. So thank you for making the time. I should add, Joe, another Joe, who's the head of ASB, is away. He sends his apologies. Chris, the COO, tells me that this is the event, Tan Sri, that has the largest number of, registration, RSVP. In fact, there's a couple of spillover rooms, Joe, out there. So once again, thank you very much, and we all look forward to listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri Asman, for your insightful and inspiring remarks that indeed knowledge coming together will build a better future. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Nungsari and Professor Stiglitz to join us seated on stage. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to invite Professor Joseph E. Stiglitz, University Professor at Columbia University, Chief Economist of the Roosevelt Institute, and Nobel Laureate in Economics, to deliver his public lecture titled Navigating the New World Disorder, a View from the Dismal Science. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be back in KL again, back in Malaysia. I didn't put in the last part, but you'll see why I said a view from the dismal science. It's not going to be totally optimistic, but I'll try to leave with some optimistic notes. Well, as I'm sure all of you know, President Trump has thrown a hand grenade into the global economy. He's thrown a hand grenade into American democracy, and he's brought about, an enormous amount of disorder. And the question that everybody obviously wants to know is, what's next? Where will this all land? Well, I won't be able to give you the answer, but I'll give you some ideas about where I think things might how things might evolve. Trump comes in the midst of changes that were already in place. And that's what makes the discussions today so, you might say, complex, so interesting. Even before the arrival of Trump, there was a broad understanding that the neoliberal order was falling apart. We were talking before about what happened in the East Asia crisis, where a lot of the neoliberal prescriptions about open capital markets were dictated to all the countries, and the only one that didn't follow those prescriptions was Malaysia, and it had a shorter and shallower downturn. You might have thought that would have been a lesson and neoliberalism would have been chastised. Didn't happen. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, all based on the result of neoliberalism, the idea that deregulation would lead to faster economic growth, and trickle-down economics would ensure that everybody would benefit from that growth. Instead, it led to slower economic growth, and the benefits went only to the people at the top. And instead of having a stable and efficient economy, we had the deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression. Again, you would have thought that would have led to a rejection of the ideas. The Chief of Staff of President Obama said you should never let a crisis go to waste. But President Obama let a crisis go to waste. And the ideas changed a little, but not very much. And I can't help but mention this. Obama chose as his chief economic advisors the very people who had been instrumental in the bad policy in the East Asia crisis and in the deregulation that led to the 2008 crisis. Somebody who, I don't know if you've been following the news, has in the last 4 days been totally discredited because of the Me Too movement and the Epstein files, and has now had to resign from all his posts. But that's a personal touch on something of a global economic order. But by the time Trump took office, it was increasingly clear that this neoliberalism wasn't working. It did not help the world get through the pandemic. After the pandemic, even the United States decided that industrial policies, which were a no-no under neoliberalism, you weren't allowed to do industrial policy. Malaysia did it, East Asia did it, every country in East Asia, but in neoliberalism, you weren't allowed to do it. Even the United States began to do it. And you might say that was the official death of neoliberalism. I should add, the United States always did industrial policies. It just didn't want other countries to do it. And it didn't want them, you couldn't call them industrial policies. It was done in the Defense Department, it was done in the Department of Energy, in the Department of Agriculture, but it just wasn't called industrial policy. But with Biden, it became open and that we were doing it, and that began the discussion of the end of the neoliberal trade order. If Trump hadn't come along, we would be having here today, I think, an interesting conversation about what would the post-neoliberal order look like. But then Trump came along, and all of a sudden we started to begin to realize that as imperfect as a rule as the rule of law was that have been the WTO, the Uruguay round, and all the rules of the game, as imperfect as that was, the law of the jungle was even worse. And that the basic principle of Donald Trump is that might makes right. And most people feel uncomfortable with that as a principle of behavior, as a principle of ethical behavior, and it's a principle of, I would say, even civilized behavior. And if I have time, I'll come back to what I mean by that. But what we are now confronting is a double problem. We have to think about what does a post-neoliberal order look like, but also what does an order in which one country becomes a rogue state and says we only care about power, and how should other countries respond, and what will that new global economic order look like? So that's the broad setting in which we are. There are, part of this is that there are new geopolitics. We were in a world where after the fall of the Iron Curtain, people wrote a famous book called The End of History, that we would all become liberal democracies and free market economies. Nobody believes that today. And so we had a short period from 1990 basically until maybe 2015 in which we had a kind of convergence, you might say a world with G1 where US was the hegemon, working to create a rules-based order in which the rules were in favor of the United States, but it was still a rules-based order. People talk about the Great Moderation. It was hopefully thought to be a period of stability. Well, we are now going back into a world that's very split. And many dimensions of that split, but the most important is that between the US and China. But in Europe, the most important split is between Russia and Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which in Europe they view as an existential matter. So those are key aspects of a very different geopolitics. Within our countries, there are also new politics. In particular, 100 and some years ago, particularly in the United States, we were worried about the agglomeration of market power. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, electricity, cigarettes, lots of cartels, trusts. And we passed antitrust laws and to make our economy more competitive. Those of you who study economics know that the basic model of the economy what's supposed to bring efficiency is competition. The reality in American economy is it's riddled with market power. And the area in which this is so evident is big tech, where in each part of big tech there's one firm or maybe two firms. And the fact that they have such high market capitalization, some people say, isn't that amazing? Well, that's evidence of a market failure. Because what you learn is that normally competition should drive profits down to zero. But nobody believes NVIDIA is going to have profits of zero, or Google, or even OpenAI. They believe they're going to continue to have market power for years into the future. So the market caps of these companies is testimony to the market failure of the American economy. It's testimony that we do not have a competitive economy. And American citizens are finally waking up to the political consequences. The picture of Donald Trump surrounded by the oligarchs, the American oligarchs, and the change of vocabulary. We used to talk about the Russian oligarchs. And when we used that word, we didn't mean it with praise. And we have the same feeling about the American oligarchs. And the change in attitudes in 15 years couldn't be greater. When the big tech companies started engaging in the social harms that they were engaged in, mis and disinformation, ethnic division, like you see in the Myanmar and in the Rohingya, racial hatred, incitement of all kinds. When that began, we said, we should leave it to them to regulate themselves, self-regulation. That didn't work very well in the banking sector. And I wasn't confident that it would work in this sector, but most Americans said self-regulation. Now, almost no one says self-regulation unless you're Mark Zuckerberg. He still likes self-regulation. He needs some more self-control. But at the same time that there is this awareness of market power and what it's doing to our democracy, and it really is undermining our democracy, there's a lurch to the right in many countries. And then there are a whole new set of problems associated with the new economic policies, the end of neoliberalism, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the questioning about the end of the dollar economy and the global trading system in shambles. But meanwhile, the old issues have gotten worse. Climate change, they're having right now trouble in Belém getting a COP30, getting an agreement, because some of the oil producers don't want to go along and save the planet. They'd rather suffer from global warming. And I'm glad you read that op-ed, the G20. Very hopeful signs that one of our recommendations, the main recommendation, was the creation of something analogous to the IPCC for inequality, International Panel on Inequality, that would identify the trends in inequality, the drivers of inequality, the various dimensions of inequality, the consequences of it, and what might be done about it on an analytic level, and keeping the issue in front of the global community. And, from a scientific point of view or social science, keep telling people, reminding us that we aren't making the progress that we should be making. So all of these issues are intertwined, and these are really very big changes in our world. Really, I would say, the most significant changes since World War II. So I don't have time to go through all these in the detail that they deserve, but let me go through, begin to talk about a few of them. Begin with the end of liberalism. As I said, the excessive reliance on unfettered markets began to be questioned after 2008. I thought it would be more questioned. But there were major changes, like the degree of globalization actually decreased. The flows of private FDI, foreign direct investment, actually declined relative to global GDP. And by 2016, protectionism was clearly on the ascendancy, especially in the United States, and Trump imposed unilateral tariffs on China. That was a violation of the most basic principle of trade policy, which is the most favored nation, which has ruled for half a century. But Biden continued those policies. But Trump, in his second term, has put this whole framework on steroids and gone after every country, including those islands with no people. He's imposed high tariffs. It's so easy for me to go on a riff about how terrible. He's filled with grievances, with misconceptions, with obsessions, and maybe I can't help but digress a little bit about this. He thinks that because the United States is the best country in the world, everybody should be buying goods from the United States more than we buying goods from them. So we should have a trade surplus with every country. Now, hopefully all of you know from your elementary economic class that you cannot have a trade surplus with every country, and that trade surpluses and deficits are based on comparative advantage, and that the overall multilateral trade deficit is based on macroeconomics, based on the disparity between domestic aggregate savings and domestic aggregate investment. They won't release Trump's grades from the University of Pennsylvania. We have a suspicion why. But it's clear whether he did well, whatever grade, he didn't learn anything. And he clearly didn't learn about this. He had 30 years after college to learn. And remember, learning till you leave school. It's supposed to be a continuing. We're giving you the groundwork from which to learn. But he didn't continue learning anything after. And he was obsessed with, growing up in the 1950s, we were all obsessed with automobiles. It was fancy cars, Oldsmobiles and Cadillacs and Chevys, and big cars. You can see them in some old movies. And he's obsessed with that. So he thinks the center of the economy are these old big cars. And he really resents Germany selling BMW into the United States and Mercedes and being better cars. So he only thinks about trade in deficits in goods. But goods manufacturing is less than 10% of GDP, much less than 10% of employment. We are a service sector economy. And we have a surplus in services. And what are some of our major services? Education, tourism, health. And what has he done? he's killed those. The Canadians do not want to be the 51st state. I went to Canada, and I cannot tell you the degree of resentment. The Canadians don't have to put tariffs to discourage people from buying American goods. They don't want to touch them. And nobody is ordering them in the stores. It's un-Canadian to buy American. So he's killed tourism. It's down 20%. He's killed education because no one knows whether they'll be able to have a visa. And education enrollment is down something like 20%. For foreign students is down about 20%. So all of these are examples at the micro level where he has been actually hurting the economy. But he won't actually probably do much about the multilateral trade deficit overall, because, as I said, that has to do with the disparity between aggregate savings and aggregate investment. And his big, beautiful bill, which is not beautiful, it's actually the most regressive tax bill in our history. It's really ugly. It was a bill that cut off health care for poor Americans and for middle-class Americans to finance a tax cut for billionaires and corporations. But overall, even with all the cutbacks in health care for the poor and the middle class, it increased the deficit, the fiscal deficit, by trillions of dollars. And what does that mean? A deficit is negative savings by government. And that means aggregate savings is reduced. And that means the gap between aggregate savings and investment is likely to increase. And that means the multilateral trade deficit is likely to increase. His hope was that by all these tariffs, he would lead to a rejuvenation of our economy. But tariffs are not, in general, the best industrial policy, the best way of rejuvenating an economy. But the way he did it was particularly bad. By the way, you probably have gotten by now a feeling that I'm not pro-Trump. So I should admit that at the very beginning. But the idea that by putting a tariff on coffee from Brazil or Costa Rica or any other country would move coffee production to the United States is absurd. We don't have the weather for coffee. So no matter, you put a 50% tariff on coffee, we are not going to be producing coffee. And the same thing, putting a tariff on Chilean copper mines. The copper mines are not going to march north to the United States. So it does absolutely nothing. In fact, it makes it less attractive to manufacture in the United States because the copper input into the United States manufacturing is more expensive, and therefore the output is more expensive and makes us less competitive. So he's actually undermining the competitiveness of the American economy. Moreover, even if he succeeded in bringing manufacturing back to the United States, modern manufacturing won't bring jobs back, and it particularly won't bring jobs back to where there has been deindustrialization and the loss of jobs. I had last March I went to China for the annual China Development Forum, but while I was there, I went to a car factory, and one of the EV factories. 2,000 workers produced 1,000 cars a day. And most of those workers were doing nothing but watching the robots put the car together. And they were making sure the robots behaved well. And the robots were behaving well, so they were basically unemployed. They got paid, but they were just watching the robots. And it was very impressive. But it was very clear that the US does not have the engineers and the supply chain that could create that kind of industrial manufacturing capacity. And that was a really important insight, and it's in a way related to perhaps Malaysian strategy, a development strategy. China, 40 years ago, 45 years ago, had a per capita income of around $150 per year. And over the intervening period, they invested enormously in education. And we've been having a little conversation about the value of different kinds of degrees, MBAs versus engineering. And they put a lot into engineering. And so now, it's interesting, this is a story about dynamic comparative advantage. Comparative advantage doesn't, some things are by endowments of nature, but some of them are created. And an educated labor force is a created endowment. And now China actually has a comparative advantage, not so much in unskilled labor, but in engineering. And that's, of course, going to be very hard for the United States to fully take on board. That it's not because China is leading in EV and battery, not so much because it was subsidized or it engaged in unfair trade practices. It just invested more in engineers, and it told the car industry, pollution, you were talking about, pollution is so bad in Beijing that we're going to be all EV. And so that was a clear direction to everybody. We better start doing research in EVs and batteries. And that's what they did. And so now the car company, the one I visited, more than half their workers are engineers. They're not production workers. Well, as I said, America's industrial policy under Biden were not well designed, but before Trump came along, they were actually working. And they were working because there was a lot of money going. So in our green industrial policy, which was called our IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, it had nothing to do with inflation, but the key person in Congress was focused on inflation. So they said, okay, we'll call it Inflation Reduction Act, but it's really an industrial policy act. So they thought this is a good. They thought it was going to cost $350 billion of subsidies. It's now estimated to provide. Before Trump came along, it was estimated it would cost between $1 and $1.5 trillion. So that's a lot of money, and it was beginning to have effect before Trump came along and stopped it. The other issue that became very big and is a fundamental issue in terms of changing the global economic order was the pandemic made us realize how important resilience was, and that markets don't value resilience. By that I mean, for instance, Germany had become totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. I had written in my book, Making Globalization Work in 2006, that I would not rely on Putin as a stable trade partner. And I said it was very foolish, this was 20 years ago, for Germany to become so dependent. Well, I don't want to say I told you so, but I did. But it was very foolish, but the market did not take into account the risk, just like the market doesn't take into account climate change. And so there is a need for government intervention to think about this issue of resilience. And the particular area that we became very, very concerned about, two areas, one that we actually did something about, which was chips. We're totally dependent, particularly for advanced chips, on Taiwan. And if China were to invade, we would be in a very bad position. So that began the CHIPS Act. It's been so far only mildly successful because we don't have the engineers that you need. These are very complex things, factories to build. That's one important dimension of resilience. We also didn't have the rare earths and minerals. And I won't have time to get into this, but in the trade war with China, that's proved to be the essential. At one point, Trump talked about the cards being all on America's side, but he forgot about rare earths and minerals, and the magnets that are so important, and that card is all on China's side, and it's not clear how long it will take the U.S. to develop capacity, if at all. U.S. claims that it can do it in 2 years, but most people say 5 to 10 years. And that means a long period of real dependence on China. The point is that industrial policies are back, but and Biden was beginning to do it well, and not well, but on a massive scale. But now Trump is doing it through protectionism, and that's really failing. But the consequence of his trade policies, which are supposed to be like an industrial policy, is that the question is it the end of the WTO and the rules-based order? It's been actually almost a decade since the appellate court at the WTO has been functioning. The U.S. has not allowed the appointment of the appellate judges. And any rules-based system, there are going to be disputes, and you have to have a court to resolve those disputes, and there is no mechanism today to resolve those disputes. And it's very clear that that rules-based system, the U.S. is not obeying it. Before the arrival of Trump, we all realized that the rules of the game that were in the WTO were written mostly by the advanced countries, mostly by the powerful companies and financial institutions in the advanced countries, not by the American people or the European people, but by powerful special interest in those countries for their interest. But what we didn't really fully appreciate was what not only was there asymmetries in the writing of the rules, there are deep asymmetries in enforcement. And Trump has shown that the U.S. and any powerful country, if it doesn't want to obey the rules, there's nothing that can be done about it, especially if the rest of the world doesn't come together. And so if you have a rules-based system in which the rules are not enforced against the powerful countries, do you have a rules-based system? Now the answer is no, you really don't. In fact, most disturbing was it's almost worse than a rules-based system because the rules are enforced against the weak countries. So even in an era where the rules are not being enforced against the powerful countries, they are enforced against the weak countries. And the real example of that was vaccine apartheid. In the middle of the pandemic, when South Africa and India asked for a waiver on intellectual property, the Pfizer and Moderna could not make enough of the mRNA vaccines. There was the capacity in South Africa and Brazil and in India to make the vaccine. They could do it. But the WTO said, you're not allowed to do it. And the result of that is millions got the disease unnecessarily, hundreds of thousands were hospitalized, and clearly tens of thousands died. In other words, the WTO trade regime put the profits of the pharmaceutical companies over the lives, over the economy, over the well-being of those in the rest of the world. And that is, I think, a dysfunctional rules-based system. I just want to say a moment. You know, I talked about inequality being a major problem. The rules of the game internationally and domestically have contributed to this growing inequality. The fact that we haven't enforced competition laws mean that the monopoly power is greater, and monopoly power is higher prices, higher profits at the top, and lower income, real incomes at the bottom. The report that we did for the G20 emphasized this growing inequality in most countries around the world. But as bad as things are, there is a real worry about they're getting worse. And getting worse because of AI. And the question is, will it replace labor, leading to more unemployment, lower wages, increased inequality? And part of the issue here is even assuming AI actually is as productive as its advocates claim, that makes the production possibilities of the economy greater. If you have the right rules, that means everybody could be better off. But if you don't have the right rules, actually, a majority of people could actually be worse off. So that's the nature of innovation. Not all innovations make society better off. They can make a few people better off, but most of society worse off. And when we talk about the rules of the game, there are many aspects of those rules of game. Liability laws, intellectual property laws. In fact, almost every aspect of the legal framework. One aspect of this is intellectual property. The AI companies have been hoovering up intellectual property, anything any of you write. I once asked AI a question, and it gave me back something that I had written. I commended it for being so smart. But the point is, if anybody else had written it, it would have given it the same, but it didn't recognize my intellectual property. Now, in my case, I'm an academic, so I don't care. I want more people to read what I write. I don't care if, but they are just taking others' intellectual property. And if you're, running a newspaper, it takes a lot of resources to run a newspaper, and they're stealing all the intellectual property without compensation. Or when there's compensation, it's an unfair bargaining problem. So the problem is actually that not only may this lead to more inequality with the benefit of that knowledge all going to the AI companies and those who are the producers of the knowledge not getting it, it actually may have the effect of making the information ecosystem worse and actually impeding innovation, standards of living. Why do I say that? Well, if you don't compensate the New York Times and other people who produce knowledge, who gather, who do the research, then they won't do it. They won't have the resources to do it unless you have government intervention to tax AI to finance it. And if they don't produce it, there used to be an expression in computer science called GIGO. Garbage in, garbage out. If you put into AI garbage, what's going to come out of AI is going to be processed garbage. But it still will be garbage. And so one of my recent papers has shown that under the current framework, there is a real risk that the quality of the information ecosystem may actually deteriorate with AI, in spite of its potential of being a more powerful tool for processing and disseminating information. It could actually worsen the information ecosystem. There are a whole set of other issues I don't have time to talk about. Let me go on and talk just very briefly. How much time do I have?
We want to, it's up to you really, but we can do a hard close like 4:30.
What?
So
I don't
it's
have
45 minutes now. You've gone 45 minutes.
How much more time do you want me to talk?
I want to give them a chance to ask you questions. Can you go like 5-10 more minutes? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, let me just say a few words about a few other issues that, related to the global architecture. That's one is the global financial system. I think is in perilous state. There's a great deal of uncertainty, a high level of debt, particularly problematic among developing countries and emerging markets. There is a debt crisis in many countries. It probably won't emerge into a global financial crisis, but for those who are, the countries who are affected, it's a big thing. Central bank independence is being attacked in the United States. The bottom line of all of this is I think the US dollar-based global financial system may well be at risk. I'm only going to talk about a couple aspects of it, but the first point is there's a high level of debt in many countries, developing countries, caused by the pandemic, the post-pandemic shocks, high oil, high food prices, and because of global financial markets, the creditor market is much more complicated than it was 25 years ago, because hedge funds are involved and China is involved. So when the Latin American debt crisis occurred 45 years ago, there were a few American and European banks. You could put them in the room, you could negotiate. That's not true today. And the private sector doesn't want to negotiate, and China doesn't negotiate. And the creditors each say, I won't negotiate if the other guy doesn't negotiate. And the result of that is nothing happens. The IMF response was to have a kind of round table, but putting people in a room without any change in incentives just means they talk a lot more. It didn't solve the problem, and the problem, it continues to be a problem of too little, too late in terms of debt restructuring. One of the key problems that is going on right now is there's a hidden bailout. The private sector is being bailed out by the multilateral institutions, the World Bank and the other development banks. And you see that in this chart here, where we don't have the more recent data, but for the last 2 years, what you see there is the net flow into developing countries today is essentially zero. And what is going on? Well, there's an inflow from the IMF and from the World Bank that is matched by the outflow to the private sector. So the private sector is running away from the developing countries. How can the developing countries finance the money coming out? Well, they're financing it through the World Bank. And one of our recommendations of a commission I chaired called the Jubilee Commission was that this not be allowed, this hidden bailout be stopped. I already mentioned the soaring U.S. debt. Trump has attacked the independence of the central bank. He believes he would be a better central banker. I think most people are not so confident and worry that whatever the economic circumstances, he just keep low interest rates and there could be serious inflation. Moreover, there is a lot of weakening of confidence in central banks, some of it wrong and some of it right. The central banks are blamed for the inflation post-pandemic. That's not right. The inflation was caused by the breaking of supply chains. That was nothing they could do about that. But raising the interest rates doesn't fix supply chains. It didn't do any good. In fact, it makes it more difficult to make the investments necessary to fix the supply chain. So the rapid increase in the interest rates, which contributed to the debt crisis, was a mismanagement of central banks. And finally, I don't know how many of you know that the U.S. has proposed defaulting on its debt. The market hasn't fully grasped this, but the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, now at the Federal Reserve, made a proposal that countries who are holding U.S. T-bills be forced to exchange those T-bills for century bonds yielding 0 interest rates. What? No, not perpetuals, only 100-year bonds. But I won't be around to, but at 0 interest rates. I asked, when I was in China, I met with some of the senior leaders in China, and I said, a little teasingly, I said, how enthusiastic are you about this proposal? And their response right away was, this is a default. The market never knows what statements that Trump makes to take seriously. You know, if you took seriously Canada becoming the 51st state, you might not want to hold Canadian bonds. But nobody takes that statement seriously. I don't know whether they should. But this proposal of the Margo Accord, as it's called, I'm not sure, how serious to take it. But in any case, the point I want to make is there are many, many reasons for one worrying about whether confidence in the dollar-based global system. China has recognized this and used to hold almost $3 trillion in dollar reserves, and it's now down to about less than 700 billion. So they figured it out, even if our markets haven't figured it out. I think it would move faster if there were an easy place to put their money. But it is one of the reasons why gold, the price of gold, is as high as it is. Well, I've already talked about how the global trading system is in shambles. I do want to make one comment about how the world is responding and how it should respond. It's a prisoner's dilemma. Each country has been acting as scrambling to try to get a better deal. And Trump has taken advantage of that discord. A particularly embarrassing example of that was what happened with the EU. EU is a trading group. EU is a larger economy than the US, a bigger trading economy than the US. So you might say, why is access to the US more important than access to the EU? Any analysis of a trade agreement would say they ought to be symmetric, or even Europe ought to get a better deal. But Europe accepted these 15% tariffs. My reaction is twofold. One is agreement with Trump isn't worth the paper it's written on, and this was an agreement that was not written down. So, my forecast was that if it had been written down, no sooner was the ink dry than he would start tearing it up. It wasn't written down, but within a couple of weeks, he started demanding more. And he started demanding that Europe repeal important legislation related to technology. They have something called the Digital Marketing Act to ensure competition in the big tech, Digital Services Act to prevent digital harms, a Privacy Act, and so forth. And he's begun demanding that they repeal those. Now, the European negotiators keep saying, we're not going to do it. But what I'm afraid of is they will, in fact, comply in enforcement, if not in legislation. Now, why did they do it? Well, that goes back to the war in Ukraine. They're dependent on, they didn't take into account their national sovereignty, economic and political sovereignty, and they became overly dependent on the United States for military, and so they had really no choice. In the United States, we're talking a lot now about one of the worst agreements, trade agreements, and that is the one with Malaysia, where you've agreed to align your policies with that of the United States. That is taking away your national sovereignty. And, you know, you might say the good news is a trade agreement has to be ratified by your parliament. It hasn't been ratified, so it's not an agreement. The bad news is he may impose tariffs. But the reality is he will impose tariffs if and when he wants to, whether you have an agreement or not. So the agreement you ought to view as nothing more than a temporary truce. And and I think that's what most countries around the world are doing. But it does give him sort of a feeling, at least for himself and the Republicans, of success. So I have to tell one little story about, I was on a panel like this with the chief EU trade negotiator. And part of the agreement with the EU was that the EU would buy X billion dollars of goods from the United States and invest X billion dollars in the United States. So I turned to the trade negotiator and I said, I must have missed something in the newspaper, but I didn't think that the EU was a centrally planned economy. I didn't know that you have the power to determine how much investment and how much imports you had and from what country. And she responded, you know, a little embarrassed, and she said, oh, what we did is we calculated how much we were going to do anyway, and we told them we were going to do that. Well, anyway, that gives you a picture that this is in part all facade and is viewed as a facade in other countries around the world, but it is still disorderly a facade. Well, obviously, I think the world ought to not let the United States get away with, Trump get away with this kind of badgering of other countries. What I want to emphasize in my final optimistic and pessimistic note is there is still need for global cooperation to solve a whole host of global problems. We have climate change, we have pandemics, the pathogens, the viruses don't carry passports, they don't know about visas, they go across borders, and if there's a pandemic festering in one part of the world, it'll go to other parts. And we need cooperation. We need the WHO. And we had worked to create that kind of cooperation. Maybe not perfect, but we were working to create that kind of cooperation. And that we have an inequality crisis, as the article that, and inequality is based in part on global rules, and the global rules are affect inequality in all countries around the world. So cooperation is in everybody's interest. We're in a moment where, as we look at what is going on at COP and the discussions in Brazil on climate, at the G20, at the Finance for Development conference in Seville in July, several different strands of thought. One of them, it was very clear, I was at the Seville Finance for Development, where the U.S. did not participate. And there was almost a kind of hopefulness, optimism, because the United States was not there. Because in many of the other agreements, many of the other discussions, like on tax reform at the global level, the United States enters the discussion, argues, the rest of the world compromises, and after 10 years of discussions and negotiations, you write an agreement, and the U.S. says, we're not going to sign. So the feeling was, like in Seville, we can do a better form of global cooperation without the U.S. in the room. We can get, we have more consensus. We can reach a consensus, a better consensus, without the U.S. in the room. And in a way, that's true at the G20 meeting going on in Johannesburg this weekend. The U.S. is not showing up, even though it's the host next year, and it expects everybody else to come to the United States with the G20. It is really quite phenomenal, the kind of but there's a feeling that this discussion on inequality would not be the same if the U.S. were in the room. So the ability to have this kind of discussion in the absence of the U.S. maybe turn out to be a positive thing, that the world can go ahead. I describe it as a G-1, where you know, most trade still is governed by the most favored nation principle. Most trade is still governed by rules. It's just the U.S. is playing by a different rule book, or non-rule book. So that's the optimism. The pessimism, the dismal science part of it is that for some of the problems, like climate change, everybody has to be involved. In the end, I think we have to try to work in this G-1 world that I've described. The architecture that we need to be working for is one where it's attractive to be in the group, the G-1, the cooperative group, and it's unattractive not to be in. When I say unattractive not to be in, there'll be cross-border adjustment, carbon taxes, consequences of not cooperating. So I think it's really important for the rest of the world to cooperate in ways to make it provide an incentive structure for the whatever countries that don't cooperate, that they want to cooperate. And we have to use some economics, some of the dismal science, to try to induce cooperation from those who seemingly can't be motivated to cooperate out of a spirit of empathy and an understanding that we live and we share one planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So there you go. Joe have actually gone through the new disordered world and identified some of those things that have been shifting and defining the future. Let me start by, notwithstanding Trump's fickleness and also changes that have preceded him in shaping the world, what is your view in terms? Are the changes that have been initiated, whether by Trump or what preceded him, are those things irreversible in the ways that actually, from what we knew, what the world was, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was going to begin, I meant to, with an old English nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again.
No.
So that's my answer to you, that the world won't be the same. We have been working since at least the end of World War II to create a borderless world. We now know that borders do matter. And we cannot blithely assume that everybody is going to obey the rules. So that is a fundamental change in mindset. On the other hand, the kind of what I described as G-1 world, where countries cooperate in many, many areas, and there are, rules-based trade agreements, ASEAN, regional, Latin America will, the same thing. There'll be smaller groups. I think there can also be agreements that are in some way deeper but narrower. What I mean by that is something like climate partnerships, where you have countries working together with not only trade but investment and R&D and technology transfer. So you go beyond trade. You make them have many, but narrower.
Yeah.
They're just a one group of commodities.
Yes. So that would be, if that's true, then the next, I don't know, couple of decades will be quite noisy then. Because
The next couple
a giant as big as the US and as militarily and politically very powerful, it'll be quite noisy.
I think that's why the title was Navigating the New World Disorder. I think it's going to be very, very tumultuous, and we won't really know how things are going to settle out. Let me just give you one other example I didn't get a chance to talk about. For 15 years, there have been negotiations over global taxation.
Yes.
And a global minimum tax. And, it's really negotiated hard. And the United States went to the G7 meeting, the last one, and said, if you try to enforce this, we will impose a tariff on you. And the other G7 said, okay. And they just surrendered. It was sort of like 15 years of negotiation going down the drain in 1 hour. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me. But the good news on that is the Africa Union has said, we really need to have a new architecture for international trade. The OECD, which is where the previous negotiations were done, was not the appropriate place. That's a club of the advanced countries. It ought to be in the UN. And the UN overwhelmingly supported this initiative of a tax convention, like we have a climate convention. And so the negotiations are now going on in Nairobi for the beginning of a process of tax convention. So it'll take years and years, but I think because in part of the bad behavior of the United States, there's a global movement in the rest of the world to try to come together to address some of these issues that have been really hard to solve.
Yeah. So the commons, the commons have been fragmented in a way.
Yeah.
The global commons have been fragmented in many ways, and
Ver-
we need to find a G-1 solution to the global commons. Otherwise, it will be quite fragmented and noisy. I'm being very pessimistic. I don't know.
Yeah, no, very much so.
Yeah. So let me get questions from the floor. I think do you have the mic going on? Oh yeah. There's a question here. Oh, okay.
Hi. Thank you, Prof. Stiglitz. I'm Mackenzie. Your work focuses on inequality. I'd firstly like to ask you if you think if somebody were to do something about inequality, would you want to put more effort into resolving income inequality or wealth inequality? And given that, in Norway, in France, they've tried wealth taxes and the wealth has just flowed out. And that a Georgist kind of land value tax doesn't seem politically feasible. What's the second best option for taxing wealth?
Thank you.
Yeah, the great question. Wealth inequality is much, much greater than income inequality. Wealth inequality has some probably more invidious effects related to politics, inherited. And in fact, one of the real concerns that our report that came out with G20 is a real change. The amount of inherited wealth is going way up, and the trillions of dollars will be transferred over the next 10 years from one generation to another through inherited wealth. So inherited wealth is becoming a more inherited plutocracy is becoming a more serious problem. Brazil at the G20, and I'm part of something called the Independent Commission I co-chair of the Independent Commission for Reform of International Capital Taxation, ICRIT, terrible name, but and we've been pushing a global minimum tax, and that was discussed by Brazil, supported by the Brazil G20 last year, and it's a very mild idea that those with wealth pay at least a minimum tax of 2% on their wealth, which means if you're getting a 6% return on your, and it's only for those over 50 million. If you're getting a 6% return, a 2% tax is a minimum tax of 33%. Not a very high compared to for workers in that comparable regime. And if you're a good investor, you'll be getting 10% return on your capital, at least, and that's a 20% effective tax rate. So just asking you to pay a 20% tax rate. I gave a talk to the National Assembly in France on the subject, and I remarked that it was remarkable how many very rich Frenchmen were willing to say that they're either tax avoiders or incompetent investors. And either they were getting less than a 6% return or they were avoiding paying taxes. Anyway, it became political. It's still difficult. I didn't persuade them. And there is a concern that I think is greatly overblown about migration, that people will leave. Just to give you one example, In the United States, you can move to Florida. You live in New York or California, you're paying at the top, the marginal tax rate is probably around 60%. You can move to Florida and pay 4%. Not to Florida, to Puerto Rico, and pay 4%. Not many people are doing it. You know, there's something nice about living in New York or California. And the evidence is that the level of migration will be, and we've done studies of it, you know, is not that great. But, I mean, you're right, you need to be a little sensitive, and I like you bringing up the Henry George tax. Henry George was a great American progressive economist in the 19th century, and he advocated a tax on land. The big advantage of a tax on land is land, when you tax it, can't move to another country. And so we say the elasticity of supply is zero, or close to zero. And so it was good economics, and actually I've shown in some of my more recent work is that a tax on land can actually enhance economic growth, because savings that would go into land speculation goes into productive investment and helps promote economic growth. So I think that's a good tax, but that's a tax that addresses the assets that you invest in, but not the distribution of wealth. And there's no magic bullet. One of the things for addressing inequality, but one of the things that I've emphasized a lot is what we call pre-distribution. How the rules of the game, competition law, labor relations, bankruptcy law, education policies, and so forth, shape the distribution of market income. And while a lot of the discussion focuses on redistribution, I like to also emphasize the role of market distribution and what you can do to get a better market distribution.
Anyone? I saw a question here. A couple more. Mike, there's one in front of you. Oh, there's a few there. That.
Prof, I think relating to the topic that you have been speaking on, navigating the new world disorder, how do you think we are going to come to some form of balance? The top 5 tech companies today is much larger than the entire Muslim world, entire OIC. We see the continued divergence between global trade and finance. The ratio continues to expand. There's too much money than trade and services. We also see the situation where the fiscal position of countries is probably coming to exhaustion. And how is it that we're going to see financing of development needs that continues to increase? You know, especially with the rising inequality and continued decline of income levels in most of the world. So, you know, how do you find that balance in this new disorder?
Yeah, so one thing I didn't have a chance to talk about is one of the concerns, particularly in this discussion I mentioned in the Finance for Development meeting that at Seville, was drastic reductions in overseas development assistance, foreign aid. And that will be particularly consequential in Africa, where they're, you know, heavily dependent on foreign aid. So the question is, where is the money going to come for development? And I think the answer obviously has to be from domestic resource mobilization. And the question then is, how do you do that? And the way I look at this is you want to increase flows in and curtail flows out so that they have more money in the country. Well, how do you do that? Well, part of it is give them greater ability to tax. We were talking the ability to tax. And the current framework, and the one that came out of the OECD discussions on tax reform at the global level, did not pay attention to the rights of developing countries and enabling them to generate more tax revenue. Another example is how to maximize, a lot of the natural resources lie in developing countries, and historically, those resources have been taken out of the developing countries without adequate compensation and without them being as useful in the development process. So like Indonesia changed their model and are now making sure that the nickel that is being mined is a basis of development and that they do more value added rather than just exporting the raw nickel. So I think this is where you know, and give you another example, the intellectual property rules that are part of the WTO TRIPS results in trillions, in billions of dollars, I think more than $1 trillion a year, going from developing countries to developed countries. So there's a lot of reverse flows going from poor countries to rich countries. So if you can stop some of that, then they will have more resources for their own development. One of the concerns that led to the East Asia crisis is hot money comes into countries, and it doesn't support real development. It supports speculation. It supports land speculation rather than real productive investment. So those are all ways in which I think we need to think about reforming the global architecture, but countries can do a lot of these things on their own to get more value for their own resources, to tax more when there's income generated in the country, and that's going to be, you know, sort of the focus going forward is going to shift, I think, from ODA to these domestic sources of mobilization.
That's a good point. It's an important question. I'm just trying to on time. I think the organizers are willing to go up to what, another 15 minutes? Yeah, okay. A lot of questions. Yes. Yeah, the World Bank, Apura is from the World Bank, so he's from the, okay.
Hi.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Thanks, Prof. and Dr. Nung. Prof, I was just wondering, would it be possible to kind of adjust to this G-1 world without decoupling from the role of financial markets, for instance? I mean, it's all well and good talking about moving to a G-1 world from a political and geopolitical perspective, but the fact of the matter is that, the S&P 500 is about 10 times the size of the Hang Seng, and the Hang Seng is about 10 times the size of the ASEAN markets all put together. How do we kind of adjust to that world and kind of incentivize the financial markets to move along to that way?
Well, I actually am very supportive of developing countries developing their own financial markets rather than relying on American financial markets. I mean, the problem when, if I look at the current architecture, money flows, there's a lot of money that flows from developing countries and emerging markets to the U.S. to be managed and then goes back to elsewhere. Now, if you ask, how confident are you that U.S. financial markets are the most efficient in allocating resources, I don't feel very confident. And anybody who had that confidence should have been dispelled by 2008. And then you look at the derivatives, you look at the speculation. You know, they're not interested in real investment. But even, I would say, even more important is something that I spend a lot of time on thinking about is information. What does a New York banker know most about, and therefore where is he going to put the money? Disproportionately in the United States, secondly in other advanced countries, thirdly in emerging markets, and fourthly in the rest of the world. So creating financial markets in developing countries is important, and emerging markets is important from an information theoretic point of view. So to me, that's an important part of development strategy of how do you create these markets at home. There's a problem of diversification, and that's where I think some of this cooperation might help. Where you have a regional banking, so you diversify outside of your country, but still keep the money within the developing countries, and within a group of countries where you have more information, and therefore you are able to ascertain what are good investments. One of the real concerns I should have added is developing countries' growth depends disproportionately on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And the big New York banks are not able to invest in small and medium enterprises in the United States, let alone
more here.
outside of the United States.
Yeah.
So that's why, what is the financial sector about? It's about risk and allocation of capital. And I think, thinking about how you can do that more locally, more regionally, seems to me the way to go.
Can we maybe have one or maybe two more? Let's see how it goes. Where's the mic? Sorry, I'm not doing the choosing. The guy with the mic is doing the choosing. Don't blame me.
Thanks, Mr. Moderator. Professor Stiglitz, appreciate your talk. So I had a clarification for you, first of all. I totally understand how climate, and appreciate the fact that climate is a major growing problem because of the negative externalities in carbon emissions. But I'm puzzled that you talk about global inequality being a problem as well, in the sense that if you look at serious inequality researchers like Branko Milanovic and others, they've shown that 150 years of global inequality has dramatically reversed itself in just 20 years, largely coinciding with the rise of Asia, call it the Great Convergence or whatever have you. In my own experience in the World Bank, working in various continents, I found that people prefer fair inequality over unfair equality. So like to get your views on that. Second is that you spoke about some of the solutions, for example, better competition laws, sounds good. But even if you have the best competition laws in the world, how do you square that with quantitative easing, like measures that flood trillions of dollars, inflate stock prices, increase wealth inequality? So you can have all the best competition laws in the world, but then if you have QE, for example, that doesn't help. And finally, since you mentioned information,
you're going over your quota.
Okay, fine. Since you mentioned information, I have to ask him this. You won your Nobel Prize for showing that markets fail because of imperfect information. That's fair, but then most of the solutions that you suggest imply that governments have all the information that markets don't, unless I'm mischaracterizing it, which which I find strange. I mean,
No.
yeah.
So let me
stop there.
begin with the last question. No, I don't begin with the presumption that government has better information. In fact, it often has worse information. But government has, when it's working well, and let me say, it doesn't always work well, but most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, in advanced countries and in many emerging markets and developing countries, it does work well. And we have to work. No, if I ask the question, well, anyway, let me. If you look at most European countries, they have good institutions, that have strong democracies, that have standards of living are actually very high, higher than in the United States. Life expectancy is higher than in the United States. There's been enormous progress over the last 250 years, and it's been based on democracies and critical role of government. There's been real success in East Asia, all based on government-led policies. It's not been the market on its own that have succeeded. So the only success, there is no free market economy that has worked on its own. The U.S. period where we took over the rest of the world and was all government-led, from farming, the Morrill Act in 1863, to all the investments in infrastructure in the Great Depression, to all the technology and research during and after World War II. It's all been government-led. The internet is government. All the mRNA vaccines, government. So there's a tendency to say government messes up, but actually all the big returns have been through government, where government has played a critical role. Now, the issue here is that it's not that the government has better information, it has different objectives. The objective of the private sector is to make money. And it doesn't care whether it makes money by exploiting people or making a better product. And what we're seeing in financial scamming is it's so easy to make money by exploiting other people. Market power is about exploitation. And you make more money out of market power. Living in a competitive economy, you don't make a lot of money. And what we teach our business students, I shouldn't tell you, is how to become a monopolist. And we teach our economic students how to stop that. And we have a wonderful symbiotic relationship between the two, and they keep each other in business. Warren Buffett put it, very clearly. The greatest investor in the U.S. And he said, I tell my managers, create a moat around your end, make it deeper every year, and if you have a business that is protected enough by a big enough moat, a monopoly, you can give your idiot nephew to run it, and he'll make money. He actually said it that way. So the point is that monopolies or the private sector incentives are not aligned often with societal well-being. And that was where Adam Smith went wrong. The pursuit of self-interest does not lead to the well-being of society. It leads to financial crises in 2008. It leads to climate change. It leads to growing inequality. It leads to every one of our social pathologies. It leads to obese people in the United States because of the food industry encouraging people to buy processed food and food that leads them, they make more money out of it. Yeah. And so if you start going through the pathologies in our society, they are in no small measure. You look at what the tech companies are doing in terms of attention span of our young people, youth anxiety. Again, their interest. Yeah, let me just give you one more example. What has been the focus of research in the United States? You know, where the center of research for the last 15 years, making a better advertising engine that exploits you to buy more goods
things
that you don't want to buy.
Yeah.
Now, is that the world's most important social problem? No, nobody would say that, and yet that's what the private sector has done. And so, what I'm contrasting, I'm not saying we ought to shut it down. What I'm saying is, the public sector is aware of the consequences of inequality, the consequences of obesity, the consequences of
inequality,
climate change. You know, and we can mildly direct some of our resources to climate change, to making our economy more resilient, healthier. I think that's perfectly, you know, it's not a question of information. Now, on the second question you asked, it is, you know, inequality is not caused by one thing, and there's no magic bullet, silver bullet, that's going to solve it. And competition is important, both for inequality and for economic efficiency and for innovation. So I feel very strongly about why, you know, pursuit of competition policy. I spent a lot of time involved in antitrust matters, competition, and I can, you know, so I've seen the dirty beast. Our companies really excel in figuring out how to create monopolies. They are really brilliant. I mean, maybe it's our business schools, but they really do a good job, and they're very clever at it. And they've been more innovative in that than they have been in making better products for increasing standards of living. But it's not the only thing. And I very strongly agree that QE has contributed enormously to wealth inequality and to diverting resources away from productive investment. Yeah. Looser monetary policy may not lead to more economic growth if it goes into land speculation. And that's why good central banks ought to have restraints on where the money goes, to make sure that it goes towards productive uses rather than unproductive uses. And we didn't do that. What was the first question?
You have a very short time to answer that.
What? Oh, yes, Branko's observation, yeah. So, yeah, and in our report, we actually talk about, so Branko Milanovic has a really, really interesting book, series of books, and you should all read them. But one of his observations, pretty clear, and we talk a lot about it at the World Bank, that in the era of globalization, you know, hundreds of millions of people have moved out of poverty. And if you looked at the global distribution of income, in that way, it looks more equal, at least at the bottom. It's mostly because of China. And enormous success in moving people out of poverty. The gap between the poorest in Africa and the richest has not been reduced. And there is more wealth concentrated at the top. Just to give you one statistic, something like 41% of all the wealth created in the last quarter century has gone to the top 1%. And the bottom 50% has gotten 1%. So, you know, there is, and those are global numbers. At the same time, what we emphasize, we live in communities, and within most countries, there's a high level of inequality. And in many countries, a very large number, the levels of inequality within those countries are increasing. And it's not universal, and I think there's an important lesson from the fact that it's not universal. That emphasizes it's not the laws of nature, but it's the laws of man, and that we can do something about it. Okay. If it were universal, you would say, oh, there's nothing you can do. But the fact that there are these different experiences and that we've managed at the global level to narrow it, you know, we should celebrate that. But that tells us that we can do something about inequality. And that should give us, you know, to give you a moment of optimism. I should end on a moment of optimism.
And we should end with that,
yeah,
moment of optimism.
Okay. That these inequalities are something that we can really do something about. We're not going to eliminate it. You know, the Bible says the poor you shall always have with you. You always get, but we don't have to have the extremes of inequality, the ways in which inequality gets created through exploitation. Those we can do something about.
What men does, men can solve, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we should end because the organizers are asking for time. I think we should. I am very enlightened, and I'm actually quite amazed by your level of energy and interest. So let's give Professor Stiglitz a big hand. So with that, I'll pass it over to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz and Dr. Nungsari, for that rich and engaging dialogue. Your reflections on global inequality and the future of shared prosperity gave us so much to reflect on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the closing remarks for today's event, we are honored to have Tan Sri Dr. Zeti Aziz, founding chair and co-chair of the Board of Governors of Asia School of Business. Please welcome Tan Sri Zeti.
Dear colleagues and friends, on behalf of the Asia School of Business, well, thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. But most of all, I would like to express our profound gratitude to Professor Joseph Stiglitz for sharing his valuable time with us today. Professor Stiglitz, we deeply appreciate your contribution to the ongoing dialogue about the future of the global economy. Your remarks here today have been truly enriching, prescient, and thought-provoking. It has been a great privilege for us to have this opportunity to listen to you today. And just like Tan Sri Asman, I would also like to take a moment to reminisce. It was about 28 years ago when you were Chief Economist at the World Bank that we encountered. It was a tumultuous time for the East Asian region. It was a time of the Asian financial crisis experienced in 97-98. I recall even at that time, your views were not quite the conventional wisdom that had prevailed in Washington. It was always encouraging for us to hear that there were alternative perspectives that took into consideration issues concerned with growth and development. The experience of this crisis had two important consequences for us: the drive towards building resilience and to becoming more cohesive as a region. This fortified our ability to effectively live through a number of other upheavals and turmoils, not to say that we were unscathed, but we were not disrupted, and we were able to rise to the challenges and advance forward. Then, it was in 2008, in response to the great financial crisis, and I always mention to everyone to always refer it to the great financial crisis and not the global financial crisis, because we were not in crisis in the Asia Pacific. Yes. So when it erupted in the developed world, that the President of the United Nations General Assembly established a commission led by yourself to propose reforms that would prevent such a crisis into the international financial system in the future. And it was my honor to have been a member of that commission. It was probably one of the high points of my career, and the report, which was released in 2009, have had its findings become the subject of continued discussions and debates at high-level international forums, and its ideas have influenced policy decisions. The report, however, unknown to yourself, probably made its biggest difference in Asia, wherever we could, we sought to strengthen our systems and the financial infrastructure of the region. And that's what made us more resilient as a region. Our motivation was we wanted to be best positioned to manage future turbulence and turmoils. Collectively, we now reap the payoffs. East Asia has now emerged as a force to be reckoned with. In his lecture today, Professor Stiglitz has highlighted that we will continue to be navigating in tumultuous waters brought about by the new politics, the new economic policies that are intertwined, as he mentions, with the old issues that have plagued the world economy. On top of this, he highlights the new set of problems presented by AI. Now, 16 years later, he has led a new commission that has just come out with its report in June. The Jubilee is known as, yes, that has addressed the debt and development crises and the initiatives needed to promote sustainable development. Addressing these vulnerabilities are so key to avoiding future financial crises and economic setbacks. The global circumstances going forward appear to be bleak, but as an optimist, I believe it is not quite so dismal. There's still an opportunity to navigate ourselves in the right direction despite the turbulence, so that we will arrive at the aspired destination. From the emerging and developing economies, we can leverage on our comparative advantage, that is, our agility to adjust, unlike matured economies who face rigidities. That our agility to adjust, and therefore the ability to do better, and thus contribute positively to the global economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in showing our appreciation to Professor Joe Stiglitz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tan Sri Zeti, for your thoughtful remarks. Please remain on stage. I would now like to once again invite Tan Sri Azman Mokhtar back on stage. A token of appreciation jointly presented by the Asia School of Business, INCEIF University, and Khazanah Research Institute will now be presented by Tan Sri Zeti to Professor Stiglitz. Thank you. We kindly invite our distinguished guests to make their way off stage as we continue with the closing.
I'm losing my concentration in reading. I can't read as long as I used to.
Same here.
As we conclude the formal portion of today's event, we invite all of you to join us for refreshments and networking just outside the auditorium. We hope you'll take this opportunity to connect, exchange ideas, and continue the meaningful conversation. On behalf of the Asia School of Business, thank you and have a wonderful evening.